A quarter of the bones in your entire body are located in your feet. It sounds like a throwaway statistic, something you'd find on a gum wrapper or a trivia card. But let that fact sit for a moment. Evolution is an incredibly stingy architect. It doesn't waste resources. It doesn't build complexity without a desperate, life-or-death reason. So, why would nature pack 52 bones, 66 joints, and more than 200 muscles and ligaments into two small appendages that we spend most of our lives trying to ignore? Why did our ancestors spend millions of years walking, running, and climbing across jagged volcanic rock and freezing mud without a single scrap of leather to protect them? And if our feet were originally designed to be the ultimate off-road vehicle, why does the simple act of walking to the mailbox barefoot today feel like a form of torture? The answer isn't that ancient humans were simply too primitive to figure out how to tie a piece of hide to their soles. The reality is far more counterintuitive. For the vast majority of the human story, shoes weren't just unnecessary. They were a hindrance. To understand why, we have to look at the foot as a piece of high-performance technology that modern footwear has essentially forced into early retirement. How does a structure that looks so fragile manage to support hundreds of pounds of pressure with every single step? When you look at a human foot, the first thing that stands out is the arch. For a long time, we thought the arch was just a simple shock absorber. But in 2009, a researcher named Sarah Rolian published a fascinating study in the Journal of Experimental Biology that changed our understanding of foot mechanics. She found that the length of our toes and the rigidity of our midfoot aren't accidents. They are specifically tuned to act as a lever. When your heel leaves the ground, your toes lock, and your foot transforms from a flexible landing pad into a rigid beam. This is called the windlass mechanism. It's an anatomical trick that allows humans to push off the ground with a level of efficiency that no other primate can match. But if this lever is so efficient, why is it so prone to injury in the modern world? Why do we have an entire industry dedicated to arch support and orthopedic cushioning if our feet are already perfect? Could it be that the very tools we use to protect our feet are the things making them weak? The answer lies in how the foot interacts with the ground. When you walk barefoot, your foot is constantly talking to your brain. This is where we run into the first major myth of the barefoot life. The idea that ancient humans must have had feet that were basically numb, covered in thick, leathery calluses that acted like a dead piece of armor. In 2018, a team led by Nicholas Holoka and Daniel Lieberman at Harvard University decided to test this. They studied people in Kenya and the United States, comparing those who walked barefoot their whole lives with those who always wore shoes. The results were a total surprise. The barefoot walkers did have thick calluses, but those calluses didn't dull their sense of touch. The researchers used a test called the two-point discrimination task, pressing small points against the skin to see how close they could be before the person couldn't tell them apart. They found that the mechanoreceptors, the tiny nerves that detect vibration and pressure, were just as sensitive in the thick-skinned barefoot walkers as they were in the soft-footed shoe wearers. The callus protects the skin from being cut, but it transmits the signal of the ground perfectly. It's like a high-performance tire that still lets the driver feel the texture of the road. But this raises a deeper question. Why does the brain need all that information? If the foot is just a support pillar, why does it need to feel anything at all? And if being barefoot is so superior for sensory feedback, why did we ever move away from it? The sensory feedback from the foot is actually a critical safety system. When you feel a sharp rock or a slippery patch of mud, your brain subconsciously adjusts your gait in milliseconds. It changes how hard your muscles contract and how you distribute your weight. When you put on a thick, cushioned shoe, you're effectively putting a silencer on that conversation. You stop feeling the ground, so you stop adjusting. You start slamming your feet into the earth with more force than you were designed to handle, because your brain thinks you're walking on a cloud. This is why researchers have found that people wearing expensive, advanced, running shoes often have higher rates of certain impact injuries than those in cheaper, thinner footwear. However, this doesn't explain how our ancestors handled the sheer heat and cold of the open wilderness. How did a barefoot human survive the scorching sands of a savanna at high noon? And if the human foot is such a sensory masterpiece, why did we eventually decide that shutting it off was a fair trade-off? To understand the heat problem, we have to look at the human body's cooling system. Humans are unique among mammals because we are elite endurance athletes. We aren't the fastest, but we can outrun almost any animal on Earth over a long enough distance. This is largely because of our ability to sweat. And it turns out, the soles of your feet are one of the most densely packed areas for sweat glands in your entire body. Louis Liebenberg, an expert on traditional hunting techniques, has documented how the San people in the Kalahari Desert perform persistence hunting. They chase an antelope for hours in the midday heat until the animal literally collapses from heat stroke. The hunters can survive this because they are barefoot. The thick calluses on their feet act as thermal insulators against the hot sand, while the sweat glands on the rest of their body keep their core temperature stable. The foot was designed to be the interface for this brutal, high-heat lifestyle. But this leads us to a massive contradiction. If we were so well adapted to the heat and the terrain of Africa, what happened when we started to leave? How did a tropical, barefoot primate survive a trek into the freezing mountains of Eurasia? Did the invention of the shoe happen because we hit a wall that biology couldn't climb? Archaeologically, this is where the trail goes cold. Shoes are usually made of organic materials like animal hide, bark, or grass. In most environments, these things rot away in a few years. We have stone tools that are millions of years old, but the oldest shoe is a title that keeps shifting as new discoveries are made. For a long time, the record holder was a collection of sagebrush bark sandals found in Fort Rock Cave, Oregon, by Luther Cressman in 1938. They were roughly 9,000 to 10,000 years old. They were beautifully woven, suggesting that by 10,000 years ago, shoemaking wasn't a new invention, it was a highly developed craft. Then, in 2008, a discovery in the Arini 1 cave in Armenia pushed the record for leather footwear back to about 5,500 years ago. It was a single right-footed shoe made of cowhide, perfectly preserved by a layer of sheep dung. It even had grass stuffed inside it, which might have been for insulation or to keep the shoe's shape. But even 10,000 years is a blink of an eye in evolutionary time. Humans have been anatomically modern for 300,000 years. If we only find shoes from the last 10,000, what were we doing for the other 290,000? Were we truly barefoot that entire time, or is the evidence just invisible? This is where science had to stop looking for objects and start looking at bodies. If you wear shoes every day, your skeleton actually changes. This is the premise of a groundbreaking 2005 study by Eric Trinkaus. He realized that when you walk barefoot, your smaller toes have to do a lot of work. They grip the ground and provide balance. This mechanical stress makes the bones in your toes, specifically the proximal phalanges, thick and robust. But if you wear a supportive shoe, the shoe does the work for you. Your toes become passengers. Over a lifetime, this causes the toe bones to become thinner and more delicate. Trinkaus examined the foot bones of early humans across tens of thousands of years. He found that for most of our history, humans had incredibly thick, strong toe bones. But right around 40,000 years ago, something shifted. The leg bones stayed strong, meaning these people were still walking huge distances, but the toe bones began to shrink. They became gracile. This is the smoking gun for the invention of the shoe. Even though the leather has rotted away, the effect on the human skeleton remains. But why 40,000 years ago? What was so special about that specific moment in history? And if shoes were invented then, why did it take another 30,000 years for them to become the complex boots we see on people like Otzi the Iceman? The date 40,000 years ago coincides with a period of massive cultural and climatic change. This was the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Humans were moving deeper into northern Europe and Asia during a time when the climate was becoming increasingly volatile. It wasn't just cold, it was a landscape of jagged ice and permafrost. This is the theory of thermal stress. You can survive a hot desert barefoot, and you can even survive a temperate forest barefoot. But you cannot survive permafrost barefoot. Frostbite isn't just painful, it's a death sentence in a world where you need to move to survive. But there's a catch. We know that Neanderthals lived in cold climates for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived. Did they wear shoes? For a long time, the consensus was no. Neanderthals were built differently, shorter, stockier, with thicker bones and a body type designed to retain heat. We assumed they just toughed it out. But recent analysis of Neanderthal sites has started to reveal bone awls and scrapers that were likely used to process hides for clothing. The question is, if they were making clothes, were they making shoes? And if they were, why didn't their skeletons show the same slender toe shift that trincas found in modern humans? Maybe the Neanderthal shoe was different. Maybe it was more like a loose wrap than a structured boot. Or maybe the modern human foot is just more sensitive to change. This brings us back to the idea of the Theopetra footprints. In a cave in Greece, researchers found human footprints dating back 135,000 years. Some researchers have argued that the shapes of these prints suggest the feet were wrapped in something. But the evidence is debated, which leads to a more provocative question. Is it possible we've been wearing shoes much longer than we thought, but only in certain seasons? Could the invention of the shoe be more like the invention of the umbrella, something you only use when the environment becomes hostile? If the shoe was originally a tool for survival in extreme climates, why did we keep wearing them when we went back to warm ones? Why did shoes become a permanent part of the human uniform? To answer that, we have to look at what happened when we stopped being nomads and started being farmers. Roughly 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic Revolution, humans began to settle down. We started building cities. And cities are a nightmare for the barefoot human. In a natural environment, the ground is varied: dirt, grass, sand, forest floor. These surfaces are yielding. They deform under your foot, distributing the pressure. But in a city, the ground is flat and hard. Whether it's packed clay, stone, or modern concrete, a flat surface is the enemy of the human foot. When you walk on a flat, hard surface, your foot hits the ground in exactly the same way every single time. This creates repetitive stress. The arch, which is designed to adapt to uneven terrain, suddenly has nothing to do but collapse. This is where we see the rise of flat feet and other modern foot ailments. In a sense, we didn't just invent shoes to protect ourselves from the world. We eventually had to invent them to protect ourselves from the flat, artificial world we built. But does that mean we've permanently broken our relationship with the ground? If we spent millions of years evolving the perfect barefoot machine, can we really undo all that evolution in just a few thousand years of wearing boots? And what happens to the brain when it's cut off from the ground for an entire lifetime? The impact on the brain is more profound than most people realize. There is a concept in neurology called proprioception, your brain's ability to know where your body parts are in space without looking at them. Your feet are a massive source of proprioceptive data. When you wear thick-soled shoes, you are essentially blinding your lower body. This is why elderly people who wear soft, cushioned slippers are actually at a higher risk of falling. Their brains aren't getting enough information from the floor to maintain perfect balance. In the early 1900s, a physician named Phil Hoffman conducted a study comparing the feet of people who had never worn shoes with those who had. He found that the barefoot populations had almost no instances of bunions, hammer toes, or ingrown toenails. Their toes were splayed wide apart, providing a stable base. The shod populations, however, had feet that were shaped like their shoes, narrow, cramped, and weak. We have effectively traded the structural integrity of our feet for the aesthetic and protection of the shoe. But if the barefoot foot is so much healthier, why hasn't there been a massive movement to go back? Why did the barefoot running craze of the early 2010s result in so many injuries? The answer is that you can't just take off your shoes and expect to be an ancient hunter. Your tendons have shortened. Your intrinsic foot muscles have atrophied. Your skin has thinned. If you've spent 30 years in a supportive shoe, your foot is essentially in a cast. If you take a limb out of a cast and immediately try to run a marathon, something is going to break. The transition back to the natural state is a process that takes years, not weeks. This brings us to the most recent and perhaps most fascinating discovery in the world of ancient feet. In 2021, at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, researchers found a series of human trackways that are 23,000 years old. These are the oldest confirmed human footprints in North America. They show something incredible: a teenager walking a long distance, carrying a child, and then walking back alone. When researchers analyzed the gait, the way the weight was distributed in the prints, they found that these ancient humans were moving with a grace and efficiency that modern humans can't replicate. Their feet were wide, their arches were high, and their stride was perfectly balanced. They weren't suffering because they didn't have shoes. They were moving exactly the way a human being is supposed to move. They were in a state of total harmony with the terrain. So, if we were once these masters of movement, what does the future hold for the human foot? Are we heading toward an evolutionary future where our feet become even more specialized for shoes? Will our little toes eventually disappear entirely because we no longer use them for balance? Some evolutionary biologists think we're already seeing the beginning of this. The gracile toe bones trincas identified 40,000 years ago haven't stopped changing. In many modern populations, the bones of the fifth toe, the pinky toe, are starting to fuse together. In a few thousand more years, the human foot might look very different. We are essentially self-domesticating. Just as we bred the wolf into the pug, we are breeding the high-performance barefoot machine into a soft, shoe-shaped appendage. But there's a final mystery that we haven't touched yet. It's a set of footprints that predates humans, predates stone tools, and even predates our own genus. They are the Litoli footprints, discovered by Mary Leakey in Tanzania in 1978. They are 3.6 million years old. They were made by a species called Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as the famous Lucy skeleton. When you look at those prints, you see something haunting. Two individuals walking together through a field of volcanic ash. And even though they lived 3.5 million years ago, their footprints look almost exactly like yours. They had the same heel strike, the same arch, the same big toe alignment. For 3.5 million years, that design worked. It crossed continents. It survived ice ages. It outlived a dozen other species of hominids. Which leads to the final, blunt question. If that design was good enough to get us through 3 million years of wilderness, why are we so convinced that a piece of foam and rubber from a factory in the 21st century knows better? Are we protecting our feet, or are we just slowly forgetting how to use them? The story of the shoe isn't really a story of invention. It's a story of a trade-off. We traded sensitivity for safety. We traded a connection to the earth for the ability to walk on ice and concrete. We traded the strength of our bones for the comfort of a cushioned sole. We didn't never wear shoes because we were too dumb to make them. We didn't wear them because, for most of our existence, we were the most highly adapted walkers the planet had ever seen. Every time you take a step, those 52 bones in your feet are trying to do a job they've been practicing for millions of years. They are trying to feel the ground, to snap like a spring, to adjust to the slope of the earth. But they are trapped. They are encased in a dark, flat, padded box that denies them every piece of information they were built to process. You think you're walking, but your feet are just along for the ride. They are the silent, weakened passengers of your modern life. And the reality is, you probably won't even think about them again until the next time they hurt. But they remember. Deep in the architecture of your skeleton, your feet still remember the African savanna, the cooling sweat of the hunt, and the time when the entire world was something you could feel through your skin. And that brings us back to the very first thing I told you. 1/4 of your bones are in your feet. If you aren't using them the way they were intended, you aren't just wearing shoes, you're living in a cage of your own design. The next time you're standing on a patch of grass or a stretch of warm sand, do yourself a favor and take them off. Let those 200 muscles breathe. Let those 26 bones lock and load. Because whether you like it or not, you are still carrying the equipment of a long-distance predator. Your shoes are just a very recent, very temporary suggestion. The ground, however, is permanent. And it's been waiting a very long time to hear from you again. You spend a small fortune on shoes to correct your walk, but the only thing truly broken about your feet is the fact that you've forgotten they're actually tools, not ornaments. You aren't walking in shoes, you're walking in a pair of very expensive, very comfortable coffins.